All right, it's 7 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine. I'm a research librarian here at the Mount Prospect Public Library. I want to welcome you to tonight's program, News Media, Truth, and Trust. We are here with our presenter, Jim Slusher, who is an experienced newspaper writer and editor. He works for the Daily Herald as the managing editor for opinion, all right, where he oversees editorial work, some syndicated columns, and letters written to the editor of the Daily Herald opinion page. Through his work, he helps shape the voice of the newspaper and does this by trying to provide a mix of viewpoints on broad social, political, current topics, as well as providing a forum for local residents to write in about their views on a variety of topics, anything that interests them. And tonight, Jim is going to talk to us about news media and literacy. So thank you so much, Jim, for being here, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Can you hear me? All right, we're good. I have more things than hands here, so I'm sorry if I look a little discombobulated, but I don't want to hide behind this podium, so I'll probably walk around a little bit and try to be comfortable and make you comfortable. I really appreciate that you've come tonight. As Catherine said, I'm Jim Slusher. I'm editor for opinion at the Daily Herald. I've been at the Daily Herald since 1989. And prior to that, I worked at newspapers in Illinois and Michigan and California. And grew up in central Illinois. So my wife and I were happy to come back to Mount Prospect and raise our families here. And our sons have now grown, and we still use the library a lot. And I'm glad to see that you do as well. And we're so happy to have you here. The program I call News Media, Trust, and Truth. I think it's really an important topic right now for so many reasons. One, because of the state of our debate publicly in general, and politically, and sort of the way we're all divided and not really conversing with each other very well, I think. And also just because media is changing so much. Daily Herald is a very different newspaper than it was when I first came here 35 years ago. And it's going to be a very different newspaper in 5 years than it is today, and probably in 10 years. And it's all changing so fast. And there are so many different ways that you can get information, you can see information, that when I used to write we used to do a survey in 1999. We began a survey at the Daily Herald that was intended to sort of gauge how well people trusted the newspaper. And we tended to get pretty good marks, but basically then they had just the newspaper to look at. Now we have the newspaper, we have Facebook, you have X, you have Instagram, you have so many TikTok, so many other ways to get information that it can be really hard to know who to trust and how to trust them. So I'm hopeful that as we talk about things today, we'll get some ideas, and maybe we can have some conversation about the best ways that we can talk to each other, regardless of what our points of view might be. You might think that I'm here to tell you that the Daily Herald is one of the places that you can trust, and I will tell you that I trust the Daily Herald in general. But that's not my point. My point really is to help us all realize, how do we trust the different things that we see? How do we trust all of these different types of media that we encounter? And maybe we can look at some different ways that we do things at the Daily Herald and find ways that will help you as you look at other forms of media, things that are going on. So my key goals, as I said, are to examine free speech, free press. What does that mean? To a certain extent, to promote self-examination amongst all of us. How do I know what I trust? Why do I trust the things that I trust? To really ask us to explore whether we're cynics or skeptics in the way we view other media, or the way we view media, or the things that we read. Talk a little bit about the difference between what's a truth and what's a lie and what's just a plain mistake. And then maybe look at Google, artificial intelligence, some other things. It's a lot to do. Hopefully we'll get through it pretty fast, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and some conversation if you'd like to do that. So first, some background. This is a Gallup survey from 2017, so it's a little bit out of date in general, but I like to point it out because it really shows a lot about what has happened to trust since the Eisenhower era, when public trust was really pretty high. And if you look at it now in 2024, it's really not so high. It's gone way down. People have become less trusting of government. Interestingly, as they've had more transparency, more opportunities to see what's going on in government, we've become less trusting in it. But that's where we've come from, and that's sort of what we have to deal with. Interestingly, the survey points out that partisans' trust in the government's management has swung sharply, but it often depends on what party is in power. Republicans tend to trust Republican presidents and government more when they're in power. Democrats tend to trust the government more when they're in power. I think that tells us something about us all and what we really trust, whether whether we're really trusting or whether we're just playing with our team. But it's an important thing for us to think about and keep in mind. This is another survey. Really, I'm not going to go into the whole thing with you, but just want to point out some things that tell us about trust, to see about trust. This was a Gallup survey on showing, depending on what your education level or your age was, how much do you trust certain things? And most adults don't, we're medium trusters, tend to trust somewhat. There are some people who trust a lot, some people who don't trust much. And then this from the same survey showed, okay, for adults, if you have a great deal of confidence in scientists, for example, how do you know that they are acting in your best interest? 70% of the low trusters say they tend to support trusters, and high trusters, almost 100%, 92% tend to trust scientists. This again was 2017. I'd really be interested to see what the data is for this in 2024. And journalists here are pretty much down near the bottom. Interestingly, one of the things to think about surveys is that that's always been the case. Journalists and politicians have tended to be near the bottom of the things that people trust. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I think a lot of it has to do with some of these partisan issues that people discussed before. Some of it has to do with, I don't know, just the fact that we see them and we have reasons we think we ought to be concerned about them, and we ought to. So I think it's very good for that people have some lack of trust or some willingness to be skeptical about the things that they see from politicians and from the newspapers and other media. One of the things that interests me about this particular chart, which shows what has an impact on who you say you'll trust. So this is a percent of adults who say that each has, like the sources that story cites, what are the impact of those sources on whether or not you trust a news story that you see. And here we see 51% of people say if the newspaper reports its sources, they have a large amount of trust in it. If 44% say, well, it has some trust in it, and about 5% say we're not going to trust it no matter what. If in this portion, they were asked, what do you trust of the medium that you see? If you see the New York Times, do you trust it? If you see the Wall Street Journal, do you have certain trust in it? If you see the Daily Herald? And here, 48% said, that has an impact on their decision as to whether they rely on that particular media. And then here, 30% said they just use their gut instinct, and 26% said they have, that's what they use, what people tell them. That makes them a lot of influence over what they trust. And what really strikes me about this is that this level, while lower, the fact that I trust the person who tells me information, you still have 85% of people who say that I'm pretty influenced by my neighbor who came over and told me whatever he or she told me. And that's not that far away from what I read in the newspaper. That I tend to trust the people who talk to me almost as much as the mediums in the media that I may see. And that causes a little concern for me. I would hope that we would tend to rely a little bit more on the sources that are cited and the people who actually do research and find things out. And here, and if you have your handout, you can see some of these numbers too, that show that the differences between Republicans and Democrats on these factors. Did I miss one? I also want to talk a little bit about James Callender. Yeah, because this topic always I find fascinating. People say things are worse today than they've ever been. Okay? Newspapers are worse now. I used to be able to trust Walter Cronkite, and I used to be able to trust all of these things. And back in the good old days when the country was founded, then you could really trust newspapers. Well, it was worse, way worse, when in the very origins of media. And if you look a little bit about, what newspapers were like and what news media was like in the 1700s and early 1800s, it was not that different of a landscape than what we see now in social media. Everybody who, all you had to do was have a press and you could write anything you wanted to. And pretty much people did. And you didn't know who to trust other than who your neighbors trusted. And so that was a pretty difficult time. We managed to make it through it. I think that's the good part. And I'm sure we'll make it through our time now. But it's important to remember that this has always been a problem for us. James Callender was a printer in 1798 who was arrested under the Sedition Act of John Adams. The Sedition Act said no one was allowed to say or print anything negative about the government. Anything, you weren't allowed to criticize the government or say something malicious about it. He was arrested, thrown in jail for 9 months. And when Thomas Jefferson came into office in 1800, Jefferson did something that we've heard other politicians do when they become president. He said, well, these guys were my friends, so I'm going to just absolve them and pardon them. So he pardoned all those people who were his friends. One of them was James Callender. But James Callender wasn't that good of a friend. He thought that because he was Thomas Jefferson's friend, that Thomas Jefferson was given a job, and he had a certain job that he wanted to be given. Jefferson thought, I'm not so sure about James Callender, so I'm not going to give him that job. And Jefferson should have left him in jail because what happened is that Callender knew some things about Jefferson, and he reported this story. It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor, Jefferson, keeps and for many years past has kept as his concubine one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally, and the name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear a striking, although sable resemblance to those of the president himself. The boy is 10 or 12 years old. His mother went to France in the same vessel with Mr. Jefferson and his 2 daughters. The delicacy of this arrangement must strike every person of common sensibilities. What a sublime pattern for an American ambassador to place before the eyes of 2 young girls. I can't imagine the Daily Herald writing a story like this today. There's no sourcing. There's no, someone told me this, or who told me this? How should I know if this is true or not true? It's just some guy put something on the front of his paper and said, guess what? Well, guess what? It's almost 100% accurate. History has since shown that all of these things generally were true, but it doesn't make it right that it was published in this way or done like this. And you would not see media, responsible media, do that today. You see it very often on the internet. So let's look at some ways to examine bias. This is one of my favorite websites for studying bias. It's called mediabiaschart.com. This is a screenshot from their homepage. They are individuals who study a wide range of media, read as you can see here, there are scores of newspapers and magazines that they evaluate on a certain measure of reliability. And you can see at the bottom, they say, you know, if it contains really inaccurate information, they're going to be down here. And up here, they're going to have, they're going to do fact-based reporting, do a strong effort at getting facts right and getting as much information as possible, more thorough and so forth. And then you can see where different publications fall. If you go to their website, you can actually make sense of this. You can pull out individual newspapers and publications and see things. Here you might be able to notice that they have sort of 60 Minutes that sort of skews left, but is generally reliable. Globe and Mail is pretty middle of the road and balanced and reliable. CBS News is one of the most reliable and advanced according to these folks. The Wall Street Journal is over here a little bit more right. Fox News is farther right. MSNBC and Associated Press tend to go a little bit more towards the left. You can see all these things are not too surprising, I think, for many of us, but they are probably more true to life than what many people may think. I get an awful lot of complaints about Associated Press, that it's a left-wing organization, a bunch of commies writing the newspaper. I don't think that. And these folks would say, yeah, they probably tilt a little bit leftward, but they're not commies like these guys over here. And they do their research, so they're somewhat reliable. And I think that's important. Another thing that I think is important is we look at websites like this, and I might talk about this more as we look at some of the fact-checking websites. The natural inclination for people who feel differently, who think, well, AP are commies, and why don't they have them in the commie slot? It's because they're commies too. And the fact is, these people do a ton of research, and they show it all. If you look on their website as to how they evaluated and how they determine these things, you may disagree with them. They're people just like all of us, and we all make mistakes, and we all have difficulties sometimes separating ourselves from our own opinions. But they show you what theirs are. They show you their homework, and you can see it, and you can disagree with it or agree with it if you want. But it's reliable to that extent. Sorry, I'm going to forget everything I said I was intending to say if I don't have something to remind me. So that was the chart website. Allsides.com is another site that I would strongly encourage you to look at if you are interested or concerned about what's reliable and how things are balanced. One of the fascinating and really valuable things that this website does is it takes a given story. In this case was from earlier this week. The Social Security Administration was going to implement in-person identity verifications. And we're going to tell people you got to come in and prove to us that you are who you are before we send you money. And they looked at that story and said, okay, how did Newsweek report it? How did Associated Press report it? How did Fox Business report it? And you as a reader now can see, oh, okay, well, if I didn't trust one of them, maybe I'll trust one of the others. Or at the very least, you'll be able to evaluate much more clearly how accurate the real truth is. There's truth in there somewhere. Probably none of these different things has the absolute truth, but probably all of them, if you put them together and look at them yourself, you'll get more truth. And here's another also from that same website, looking at the same story, the different ways that this was reported, the capture of a criminal off the 10 most wanted list from Trump. I think it's really fascinating to look at the headlines. Fox News said 3 FBI most wanted fugitive arrests in 2 months signal return to premier agency. Very positive pro-Trump bias. From the center, Newsweek was more Donald Trump and Joe Biden's FBI most wanted arrests compared, okay? Now you can compare it. That's a little bit more centered. You can take a look at both of them and compare them. And then from the left, ABC News said FBI arrests alleged MS-13 letter with the help of Mexican government. All the same story, all the same information, headlines skewed a little bit differently. And you'll see somewhat the same on the other story from about the judiciary. And finally, one other site I'd like to show you is called trustingnews.com or .org. Trustingnews.org is really aimed more towards newspapers. I raise it here because I want to show you that within our organization, within our community of newspapers and news media, we have a site that helps us be honest with ourselves, asks ourselves questions about whether we're reporting things honestly or not. And there are many ways that you can actually use the site. They will come out and evaluate your newspaper and evaluate how well you're doing. They ask a bunch of questions. I think it's really good from your point of view. You may want to look at this and see what kinds of questions they expect a newspaper to ask itself if it's going to be reliable. How to use the resources, where your sources fall, how reliable are the sources that you use for the stories that you report. Okay. Let's talk now about questioning truth. I really want to get into the concept of skepticism versus cynicism. I like this because it is such an important part of helping us evaluate our government, our newspapers, the things that we read. Cynics see everything as pretty negative. Cynics aren't necessarily, cynics are just going to disbelieve almost anything they see. That's the definition of the term. A skeptic, on the other hand, and I encourage us all to be skeptics, is going to say, you know what? I like what they're saying, but I wonder if it's fully true. Or, boy, I really don't like this. I wonder if there's more to this story than what seems to be showing. And that, I think, is really valuable. That is what helps us make a better community, make better decisions in our own lives as well as in our community life. Take a look at some things. These are really going to deal with, I'm going to use editorial cartoons to discuss the topic here. Here's one that I will describe as a pretty cynical cartoon. First one shows Albert Einstein. Empathy is patiently and sincerely seeing the world through the other person's eyes. Einstein. Or Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, the death of human empathy is one of the early and most telling signs that a culture is about to fall into barbarism. Pretty impressive quote, probably somewhat true. It is the one characteristic that connects all the defendants, a genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow men. Evil, I think, is the lack of empathy. And this was from Captain Gilbert, who was a psychologist assigned to the Nuremberg trials. Pretty good setup. And then Elon Musk, the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. It's a pretty bad picture of Elon Musk. Pretty bad statement. But I saw this cartoon and I thought about using it. And then I thought, no, I just don't know. Is that really what Musk said? That nobody should have empathy for other people, or that it's wrong for us to care about each other? So I looked into it a little bit more, and that isn't what he said. I won't read all of this, but this is something that you can find online. It's the text of the actual interview from which that line came. A lot of news media reported just the line of him saying, the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Truth, true fact. You're quoting him accurately, but it's not what he meant. I'm not sure that what he meant is so cool, but this is not what he meant. In this discussion with Joe Rogan, who, by the way, you'll find in that sort of lower right-hand, not very reliable, off to the right seen of that previous chart. But still, he's had a discussion with Joe Rogan. They talked about empathy, and they were saying, you know, people are sometimes too empathetic, and you can get hurt if you're too empathetic, and you just be so empathetic that your government actually takes advantage of you. And that's what he was trying to say. The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy, the empathy exploit. They're exploiting a bug in Western civilization, which is the empathy response. So I think, you know, empathy is good, but you need to think it through and not just be programmed like a robot. Still not sure I'm on Elon Musk's page with that, but I'm not going to say that he's a Nazi who doesn't care about other people. And I think that when we see cartoons like the previous one that I showed you, it reinforces among the people who hate Elon Musk something that's not entirely true. And it insults people who might be more willing to give him some credit. Let's take a look at another one. This is a cartoon that I did use. It shows the White House, President Trump, you want to abolish the education department? Yes, I love the poorly educated. Well, Trump said that also. Exact quote, accurate quote. And he obviously wants to get rid of the Department of Education. But what differentiates this to me from the previous one, I would say the previous one was cynical. It was just mean. Just sort of, we're going to say things bad about this person just to be saying things bad. This, I think, opens up a room for conversation. We can talk about, well, wait a minute. Is he really saying that he loves the poorly educated, that he wants to be poorly educated? In fact, if you think about Trump, what he says is he doesn't like the education department because he doesn't think it's doing his job. So it's really just the opposite. And so reasonable people can have a conversation about whether this, you know, it's kind of a funny take on it, but whether it really means what it shows. And then here I want to show you one that I have a lot of questions about. I haven't decided, in fact. It shows Adolf Hitler sort of standing behind American universities, and the message is that our American universities are allowing Palestinians to protest and make a lot of noise, and therefore they're helping the Nazi cause. They're anti-Semitic and so forth. To a certain extent, I think that message can resonate. It can create some conversation. How much are our universities responsible for some of the things that are being said on their campuses? But it disturbs me a lot the way we throw these images of Nazis and Hitler around for kind of a stretch. And in the particular stretch here, even though it relates to Jews in Israel, is that the same people who have this thought, who would agree with Dick Wright, who's a very extremely conservative cartoonist, they're constantly complaining that universities are censoring speakers who come to their universities. And so now I'm going to say, well, you know, they don't like it if I don't let Rush Limbaugh come to speak to my crowd, but it's fine, you know, to censor Palestinians. I don't know, cynical or skeptical. I'm not quite sure. I think there's some room for discussion there, but I think it goes a little bit too far. Now I'd like to talk about lies and truth, because we use this word, and there are a lot of lies. And I will tell you, my personal belief is that our president is someone who lies a lot. And I will tell you, my personal belief is that there are a lot of other politicians who lie a lot. Not quite in the same way or to the extremes that we see in this one. But I will tell you also that I think our president makes a lot of statements that he doesn't believe or doesn't know or just shoots off his mouth about. Same as my brother, same as some of my best friends, same as me sometimes. And does that mean he's lying? No, I would say not. In some cases, yes, in some cases, no. What I really think is that we need to ask ourselves what that word lie means. Got a letter someone submitted this as a request for a letter to the editor, something they wanted published. It says, in his op-ed in today's Daily Herald, Keith Peterson, who is an occasional guest columnist for us, wrote that USAID was created by an act of Congress in 1961. This is an outright lie. In fact, the U.S. Agency for International Development was established by President John F. Kennedy by executive order on November 3rd, 1961. Look it up. An outright lie. I thought, and first I know Keith very well, and I thought, he's not the kind of person, A, he's not gonna lie about it, but he's also not likely to be wrong about it. So I looked it up. And in fact, if you look it up, this is sort of a composite of what you can find. There's a lot of detail that goes into this. But in point of fact, under the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, signed by John F. Kennedy and approved by Congress, it created a bunch of these agencies, and he did, in fact, sign an executive order that established USAID, but it was part of a congressional act. It was not improper. It was totally up the board. And it was not a singular thing that John F. Kennedy did. So I didn't use that letter because he was wrong. But also I bring it here because it just struck me that the writer was so emotional about what he had seen that, gosh, this person is just trying to lie to me. He lied about when this was started. It wasn't a lie. At worst, he was wrong. And it turns out he was actually right. Here's another one. Similar thing. This came in a letter to the editor. Why are you not reporting the story of the Louisiana man who created 34 different names, addresses, and social security numbers and collected $1.1 million in social security over a year? Well, the reason that we didn't is because it didn't happen. This person found this, and you can find it it's all over the web. There's this complaint. And if you look at these Reuters fact checking and yahoo.com fact checking, it's also on Snopes. They all look at these, find where it came from, and look at what people are saying. And it just didn't happen. But it shows you what people are willing to believe if they have a certain mindset, whether we're liberal or conservative. When we see things that make us feel good about how we believe, we tend to believe them, and we tend to take them almost at face value. And I would stress we're better off to be skeptical and avoid doing that. Now, I'd like you to consider this story. Forgive me, I'll read it real quickly. A Maine man lived under two identities for more than half a century: his own and the identity of his brother, who died as a baby in 1939. Federal prosecutors said. It's important. Napoleon Gonzalez, 86, of Etna, assumed his brother's identity in 1965, according to court documents and federal prosecutors, who said he obtained passports in his brother's name and was issued a social security number for him in 1981. Eventually, Gonzalez began collecting Social Security retirement benefits for himself and for his brother until March of 2020, when his scheme surfaced with the help of a facial identification technology. I think that's fantastic. They have somebody in the Social Security Department said, well, these two faces look very different. They got different names. And they used facial ID and said, Napoleon isn't who he says he is. And it's unclear how much in retirement benefits he collected. In January of 2020, a detective with Maine's Bureau of Motor Vehicles Division of Enforcement, Anti-Theft and Regulations reviewed records with this technology, discovered the man's face on two separate ID cards, one issued in his name, one issued in his brother's name, according to a trial brief in federal court. A jury found Gonzalez guilty of one count of identity theft, 2 counts of passport fraud, 2 counts of Social Security fraud, 1 count of mail fraud on August 18th. I raise this because throughout all of these 4 paragraphs, the sourcing of this information is repeated many times. If you have any question about this story, you can go to these sources. You can find out who did it. And then the story came from legacy media, from the Miami Herald. If you want to find out more, go to the Miami Herald and you'll find it. And that's the kind of thing that I think you find in responsible media. Yes, it's an outrageous story. And somebody wanted to make us a point about whether Social Security is capable of being duped or whatever. You can make that point, and this story might be one of your options to do that. But if you do, you'll be making it with reliable, actual information. Yes, and this is a really recent story, and I sort of want to bring this up to discuss something that we're talking about now, and a very story that's going on now. This came in a letter. I want to bring to your attention some misleading and deceitful sentences in the story written in the Daily Herald involving a shooting by Aurora police officers. Whether deliberate or accidental, it was a breach of journalistic ethics. First, the headline itself is misleading. It said the shooting took place after a chase. While factually correct, it was still misleading and dishonest. The incident originated with a chase where an officer was severely injured and culminated when the perpetrator pointed a gun at the arresting officers. Then and only then did they shoot him. Secondly, the story said the driver showed a gun. Quote, in this writer's voice, the driver pointed a gun at the officers and they fired at him in fear of their lives. The author changed the entire narrative by her choice of words. Whether this was intentional or due to an inexperience, she manipulated the officers' actions and painted them in a poor light. I would like to submit to you that the opposite is true, that the person who was trying to put somebody in a poor light is the writer of this letter. Let's take a look at what the story said. Aurora police kill man after chase. Yes, it is true. There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 letters, 6 words in that headline. We can only get a certain number of words in a headline. How we would get in after man, did whatever he did in another town and nearly hurt somebody. You just can't get it all in the headline. So the headline is not intended to be dismissive of what he did. It's intended to say, here's what happened. Read the story and you'll find out. And if you read the story, you get all of the information that this person actually reported. And then I'd like to emphasize that in the story, the text of the reporter's thing was, authorities say that as officers approached the car, the driver showed a gun. It doesn't say authorities say officers were in fear of their lives and shot him. It doesn't say anything about whether he pointed at them. This reporter could only responsibly say what she was told. If she had made up other stuff because she assumed that the officers were in fear of their lives, or because she assumed he pointed the gun, then that would be a breach of ethics, and that would be a great disservice from us to our readers. And here's from the story as it came up to yesterday. The police have actually shown this. You can see here he has a gun. He's not pointing it at anybody yet. So as far as I'm concerned, our story is still as accurate as it could be based on what we knew at the time. And then you see how we reported it over here. He was holding a firearm as police officers approached, and 2 officers shot him. And I point out that at a vigil Thursday night, Leppy's brother, Brian, said he had seen still images of the moment before the shooting too. He said the picture proved his brother was not aiming a gun at police and that he was trying to surrender. And whether I believe that or not, how I believe that, who I side with in this case, I'm not here to say. What I am here to say is that there were different points of view and they were included in the story. And so if you want to question them, if you want to be skeptical about police, the opening is there to do that. There are some questions that still need to be answered. And police, as you see at the end, they expect to release more video and understand that this story is going to go on. And there will be a lot that needs to be answered over time. Tell you a little story that I just heard today. One of our editors that is related somewhat to this concept of how things get passed along. She was a reporter many years ago, and a well-known restaurateur in the suburbs called and said, "Hey, I got this great story for you." I have this employee who has 8 brothers who served in the Iraq War and were killed. And her husband was also killed in the first Iraq War. What a coincidence. What a horrible story. You really need to do something about this. So the reporter naturally called this person and asked her some questions about it. And she said, yeah, she was a little iffy on her. And acted like she didn't really want to talk to me. She was a little concerned. And I just felt something wasn't quite right. So I called the military and she asked if there were people from the Iraq War of these names that supposedly had been killed there. And the military had no record of that. And so she went to the first Gulf War and she said, do you have a record of this person? And it had no record of that either. So she kind of set it aside. Her editor was very gung-ho for the story and said, this is a great story. How can we not be doing this? She said, I don't know. I just don't feel good about it. And I think there's something wrong. I can't get verification. So then the restaurateur called and he says, look, why aren't you doing this story? This is a wonderful thing. And she said, well, I checked it out and it just doesn't seem to check out. So 2 days later, he calls the reporter back and says, yeah, forget it. It didn't happen. She was trying to get out of work. She was trying to get out of work. And so in order to get out of work, she passed the story along. And I kept thinking how in today's environment, if somebody put that on the web, it would be all over the place. And we would all be saying it happened and it would be true. And, we just got to be more concerned and more skeptical. And thankfully, responsible reporters, broadcast news, social media, and newspapers in particular, check things out. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. It's our most famous statement. And we do that. So you have on the handout list of a number of different sites that you can go to help when you see something that sounds ridiculous. Wow, did that really happen? Generally, you'll find it on one of these, and usually Snopes, if it's one that's really getting around, Snopes is really good for helping you identify how true or not true. And what I like to emphasize, because a lot of people diss fact checkers and say, well, the fact checkers are all liberal too, so no wonder they say what they, well, all these fact checkers, they show their work. You may still think they're liberal, you may still not like what their response was, but they show their work. And if you show your work, what else can you do? Next few slides I'm going to show you as we get into artificial information. It shows kind of how much worse that it all can get, but also how much better. These are slides that actually were put together by Jeremy Gilbert, who is a professor at Northwestern University who did a program for us at the Daily Herald a few months ago, looking at artificial intelligence and showing some of the things that are being done. Sports stories are being written by major newspapers. They get the data, they give it to ChatGPT and say, write a story about this. And it writes a story and puts all the information together, and they're able to get more information with less cost. So is that really going to happen and going to change our world? Probably to some extent. But there are many things happening in AI that are a little bit more problematic. This one, there were newspapers in Hawaii that said, we don't need reporters anymore. We're going to do everything with AI, and we're going to create these video people who will report the news. Didn't work so well. They went back to having actual reporters. But some really good things have been done through AI. One of the things that was done by the San Francisco Chronicle is that they created a database using all of their information of thousands of restaurants in San Francisco and Northern California area. And they created a artificial intelligence modem that allowed you to tell them, I'd like Chinese restaurant in this such and such a area that's got a rating of 5. And you could find you could put that thing in and it would help you find the restaurant that you might want to go to tonight. They also had 30 years of Kamala Harris reporting because she had been a politician in California, an attorney general. And they said, you know what? wonder if we could create something where someone would ask a question like she's Kamala Harris, and they'd get information from all the past. And so they were able to create this format where you could go to their website, ask things about Kamala Harris, and it would go through their reporting and get answers that were as reliable as whatever had been reported at the time. There are some dangers. Northwestern has tried to use AI quite a bit. One of the things that AI did was take this picture and they said, okay, describe this photo for us. It was taken at Wrigley Field. You see the ivy in the background and the football players, and it actually described a mob. It didn't say it was a protest, but it said it was a mob of people in front of a forest. And so there are some things that still need to be worked out. And so in conclusion, some things that I'd like to mention. This quote is taken from the Pew Center as it looked at data over the years about trust. It said, if there's an upside to the fact that we have a national problem with trust, it's that we know it. About 2 in 3 Americans say it's very important that we raise the level of trust we have in the federal government. Even better, most of us think we can do something about it. More than 8 in 10 Americans say that confidence in the government can be increased, according to a 2018 survey. Their suggestions for how to go about this range from political reforms, such as increased transparency or term limits, to asking for more integrity from our political leaders. A majority of Americans, 58%, also say it's important to raise the level of confidence we have in each other. Around 9 in 10 say that we can make progress here. Some of the most mentioned suggestions being less partisan, embracing values such as honesty and kindness, and electing more inspiring leaders. Expecting more inspiring leaders, we've had a problem with that for 250 years. We're probably still going to have a problem, but we can certainly be less partisan all of ourselves. We can certainly embrace honesty and kindness. I would encourage you to listen to this if you're really into this subject, because Honora O'Neill, a philosopher from Britain and a professor in Britain, actually says some things that are a little bit different from what I've been talking about so far. She argues that there are 3 things that relate to trust. There's a claim, an aim, and a task. She says the claim is that we don't have very much trust. And that claim is based on polls that have been done over the years. She emphasizes accurately that if you really look at it, there wasn't a lot of trust a long time ago. And if you look at those charts that I showed before, many of those same numbers would have appeared in 20, 30, 40 years ago. She says the other aim is that we need to increase trust. But she would say, no, well, we need to increase trust in sources that are newsworthy. I don't want to increase trust in sources that are not trustworthy. I want to help distinguish that. I want to help people understand whether I can trust someone or not, and when I can trust somebody. Do I trust a 27-year-old woman to teach my kindergartner? Yeah, I probably do. She's been through everything. Do I want to drive the bus? I'm not so sure. There are ways we trust people and ways we don't trust people. And we need to really think about that ourselves as we think about what we're going to do. And then she says that the third thing is the task is implied that we want to rebuild trust. She says that's thinking backwards. What we really need to rebuild is confidence among other people. Trust is something that's given, and it's given to people who show that they have deserved it. This is not, as my wife described it, a bait and switch where I give this program and then try to sell my book, but I am here to sell my book. I do have a book that I'm happy to sell. You don't have to buy it. I don't necessarily want you to, but I'm happy if you enjoy it and see it. But there are some things that I wrote about in the book that are related to this that I wanted to read just briefly from former columns. Really, I'm just going to focus on this one column. It was written in 2023. And I'm not going to read the whole column, but just a portion that I think is relevant to what we're discussing now. Probably since before Charles Pinckney took 5 years off his actual age so that he could be seen as the youngest member of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Imagine that, someone took 5 years off his age just so that he could go down in the history books as the youngest member of the Constitutional Convention. Would we do that today? I hope we would report it on it. An inclination to lie has been considered as an assumed attribute of politicians. In other words, we've always assumed that politicians lie to us. That's the cynic in us. When I was taught in the 3rd grade that George Washington told his father, "I cannot tell a lie," I chopped down the cherry tree. My teacher emphasized that the story was important because lying was so common among political leaders that this episode demonstrated a congenital difference in the makeup of our first president compared with all other politicians. So it's no surprise that distrust is sewn into the fabric of our attitude toward government. And that's probably a good thing. Experience teaches us all too well the painful consequences of naively accepting the word of any would-be leaders about what they will do or why they will do it, especially those who must curry votes in order to get and keep their jobs. Even so, there is something troubling to me about the way the word lie is wielded and thrust about in public discourse these days. Of course, blatant lies need to be identified for what they are, and of course, the serial lies of a George Santos need to be publicized and condemned. But in so much political discussion online and in print today, there's a tone of challenge, as if there's some implicit competition going on in which conferring the titles of worst liar or also a liar on someone vindicates everyone else. Paradoxically, there is simultaneously that presumption, as Santos himself stated, everyone does it, so what's a big deal? The latter point is one that we can trace to Pinckney and Washington's day. It's one we citizens must wrestle with constantly. How do we respect our leaders if we matter-of-factly assume they can't be trusted? Ironically, almost no one today believes George Washington did in fact chop down a cherry tree and admit to it rather than tell a lie. Yet, we're all still able to respect his reputation for integrity. So in our own time, there surely is an appropriate balance point somewhere in the assessment of politicians and lies. It's clear to me that no one has found it yet, but in our reading, writing, and talking, let's at least keep looking. I thank you for looking here with me at that today, and I hope it's been of some use. Thank you. If you're interested in a book, I'll be over there and can do some business. And otherwise, thanks a lot for coming.
And if anyone has any questions, now would be the time.
Indeed. I'm so sorry. Yes. Yes.
How different do you think it is in 2025 and 2026?
I think it's more profound, probably very similar, but more profound. I tried to find some more of the exact same charts that were more recent, but I couldn't find them. Yeah.
Deeper into their thoughts.
Yeah, my reading of society is that we're pulling apart more than we're coming together, and we're more skeptical and more cynical than we were even before. Yes, ma'am.
What do you make of newspapers? I can think of one major one in the Chicago area that seem to have moved away from original journalism and editorials to becoming aggregators of material produced elsewhere. Not just the Associated Press, but you could pick up a local newspaper and see the New York Times.
Mm-hmm. I think there's some risks in that. I think, the people consuming that are going to determine whether it has value for them. I will say this, a huge difference between the Daily Herald of 2025 compared to the Daily Herald of 1989 is in 1989, we wouldn't have done anything with the Chicago Sun-Times. We would have done everything we could possibly do to beat them and make sure that they didn't get the same story that we have. We would have done anything to beat Shaw Media in McHenry on a story. And that would have been our main goal. And we still want to do that to a certain extent, but there's a lot that we can't cover that we used to be able to cover that Shaw does cover. And there's a lot that we cover that Shaw needs covered. And so we work with each other a lot more than we ever did before. And I think that that is actually to the good of the consumer rather than hurting them. Yes.
How much of the lack of trust goes back to the Warren Commission report? We spent months and months and millions, and the final conclusion was just what the police said. Harvey Oswald did it by himself. Compound that with years of lies about Vietnam, and then this sudden, all of a sudden, crazy notion that somehow the landings on the moon didn't really happen.
Yeah.
That all of that was fake in a studio. And you know, the plausible notion that these pictures weren't right and all of that, all of this, it seems to me, was the foundation of this Tower of Babel that we're climbing up so fast now.
Well, I think it probably happened before the Warren Commission. I think the Warren Commission was probably a part of this whole phenomenon, and I think we're still living with it. And it is, to some extent, I think, fomented by people who don't want us to talk to each other. You know, I've seen comments that to the effect that when people are constantly getting you to not trust other people, it's not that they want you to trust them. They don't want you to trust anybody, because if you don't trust anybody, then you'll trust them. If I can make you not believe in anything except me, then suddenly I'm all yours. You're all mine. And I think that's what we have to be afraid of, is not being able to trust anything. And I think we need to be able to recognize that, yeah, the truth is you can't fully trust everything, but you can trust a lot of things more than many other things. Yes.
In your paper, you go to great lengths in local elections.
Yeah.
Whenever you talk about these people, you don't necessarily mention party.
Well, we do with legislative elections, but the local elections right now are nonpartisan. So we don't mention party because they're not supposed to have a party. We are actually looking into this, some of this, because there are a number of candidates, a number of races around the country, including here, where Republicans and Democrats both are sort of getting behind candidates more than they used to, even when they're not supposed to.
Consider including that.
Well, the problem is that we couldn't be accurate if we would say someone is a Democrat, because, I mean, we wouldn't know and couldn't know. And it's supposed to be a nonpartisan race, but we can show who supports a person, and that's probably the way we'll have to get around it at some point. Yes, our questionnaires, I think, are really useful for people. I hope. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
They address the reason for the crisis.
Oh, I think that each one of us might have a different answer to that question, depending kind of on how we feel about immigration. I do think that we have all tried to the extent that we can. We've done a lot in the Daily Herald to show the impact of immigration over the past 2 years in particular, or 3, and how, busloads of people being sent to Elgin and other towns, how that affected those towns. We've done a lot to try to show, what causes migrants to want to come here as well. Sure.
Signed an agreement with foreign countries called the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration. and protection, and also a Declaration of America. So our DHS, State Department, was actively working with the Southern Hemisphere to bring people up. It's stated Alejandro Mayorkas set up migrant camps in Panama and Darien, which caused a lot of people to risk their lives, women getting raped.
Oh, sure. Well, I think there's a lot in there that requires a lot more study than we have the ability to go into here and does, right. Right.
So I don't think the Chicago media, they want to blame Greg Abbott in Texas. I don't see this as Democrat versus Republican because Greg Abbott had a huge illegal colonial too.
No.
But it's illegal,
Mhm.
it's an industry.
Yeah. Well, there's been a lot of reporting along those lines, not to the extent perhaps the depth that you might want, but it's been there. Yes, sir.
Jim, I want to compliment you, as this gentleman said, about like
Well, thank you.
about the sometimes it's announced no longer out there.
Right.
How tough is it for you these days? Small staff with less revenue to continue to do these things. Praise you on it.
Wow.
Continue.
Well, thank you. It's very hard. It's very difficult. We have a much smaller, we have a staff about a third the size that we had 10 years ago. And yet we still try to do something similar to what we did. Obviously, we've had to cut a lot of corners. We can't report to the depth that we used to report locally, the way that we did. We continue. I'm now one person doing an opinion page that we once had 5 people doing. And frankly, I think I do as good as 5 people, but that somebody else might disagree. But it requires us to work a lot harder. And the people who are with us, are still with us, are working very hard to accomplish something close to what we were able to do in the past. But we recognize that we can't do the same. We have to work with the Shaw Media. We have to work with the Chicago Tribune. We have to work, differently and think smarter than we used to. And I think that's good in some ways. It's helped us. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a.
That, you didn't say it strongly. We gotta say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much.
for sticking
Thank you.
Everybody, anybody we can trust, it's the people who put the words on paper. Because you can't dodge it then. You wrote it,
Yeah.
your name is on it.
It can come back to haunt you. Trust me, that happens. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Yes, sir.
Fact-checking sites.
Mhm.
At the top, you had Snoop.
Snopes, yes. Mm.
Who did find people?
I can't say. I don't know. That's beyond me. Well, you can trust that they show you their work. If you want to know that, you go to Snopes and they'll tell you that. It took a long time and one of the interesting things for me that I didn't mention, the one site, allsides.com, it shows you all different sides. Well, one of the stories that was on that your handout that's on that homepage was about another fact-checking site that they were questioning its values and its ability to fact check. So it was like even at that level, there's room for debate, question, and there's really no good answer to some of these questions. All we can do is ask the questions and get the best answers that we can. Yes, sir.
Thank you for some advice that you gave in one of your editorials in the Daily Herald. I passed it along to friends.
Oh,
And that is, if you want to assess bias in a journalistic article, look for the adjectives. And the more superlatives you see, you know which way it's slanting. So thank you.
yeah. Oh, thank you. I always like, when it comes to good writing, one of the things I heard was that Ernest Hemingway used to write his stories, and then he would go through and eliminate all the adjectives and adverbs. So it was just nothing but subjects and verbs, and objects. Uh,
I'd like
yes,
to
Frank.
recommend to everybody to get a hold of Jim's book.
Thank you, Frank.
He's talked about it.
Thank you so much. Catherine, did you have something?
I actually have
Yes.
a question. Do you think it's important when looking at newspaper media, to look at who owns the newspaper in terms of how
Oh, sure.
to assess?
Absolutely,
Content.
absolutely. You look at who owns Fox News, it's owned, we know a lot about him, and he's a very conservative billionaire. Look at who owns various other media. Daily Herald is owned by its employees, so that tells you a little bit about where we come from. But obviously, who owns any media, or the famous statement of the long past was, how do I know, what is freedom of the press really? And someone responded, well, as long as you own one, you're free to, you've got a free press. And that's really true in media today. As long as you got a laptop, you have your own press and you can put out whatever you want. Yes, sir.
You had a slide that showed story Rich about the person who perpetrated fraud, Social Security fraud.
Yes.
That-
Yeah.
So one thing I'm curious to have you comment on is, so I think that was an example of a story where there was a lot of there was research done, and they showed, how it was that they came to understand the situation, presented facts with something that's back.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So that was a reliable story, is if I understood correctly. One problem that I think, aside from people being cynical or overly skeptical and not knowing the truth from what's false, is taking even things that are factual and coming to conclusions from them. So you could look at a story like that, and you could say, here's an example where somebody did perpetrate fraud against Social Security, and go leap from that to a conclusion that, well, this is widespread. This is something that happens a lot. So you can even, people, if they don't use their critical thinking skills, can find factual information, true information, but use it in the wrong way and come to conclusions that are not true, especially, if they've already decided, they already believe, well, I think that there is a lot of fraud. So you can find the facts, you can find the truth, and then still, go in the wrong direction.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Hopefully, when you do it, I'd like you at least to base it on the Miami Herald rather than something that you saw on Facebook, because at least if, we're all going to come to whatever conclusions we can come to based on our own lives and families and personal situations.
I'm saying you need to be cautious.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Not to take even the truth.
Right. Well, and actually, I think an important thing to realize is we like stories that have a beginning, middle, and end. We really like it when they end and they have a moral, and the moral is the Social Security is full of fraud. Well, the story from the Miami Herald, if you read the whole story, his attorney says, well, Napoleon, he was told that it was okay to do this. And, he got charged and he's going to go to jail for it. But there is a part of his story that still needs to be told. And, when we come to conclusions, we have to realize there's way more to everything than the simple beginning, middle, and end that we find so comfortable. I'm sorry? Oh, the book is $20, and I'll be happy to sign it for you. And the library has a copy, and you can get it for free here too. So I just want you to read it. I don't care. I'd love you to buy it, but I'd especially love you to read it. Okay, one last question. Yes.
About the environment.
Jenny Wooden, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, she's moved on. I can't remember. She's working for an environmental site, now. And she was, yeah, she was very good. She was very talented. Yeah. We wish we had the resources to get another person like her.
That's not a question.
Yeah.
Just an idea. Or most famous presidents, Abraham Lincoln said, be careful what you read on the internet.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. One other? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, one question.
I right now, which has been heightened. Are journalists, I mean, if we're seeing ABC attack for misstatements. Your staff, do they have the ability to get representation?
Yes, but it's very expensive. We have always been, from time immemorial, concerned about lawsuits in the litigious society. That's always been something we have to be afraid of and concerned about. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.